Today we're going to talk about the Crusades. Oh, Stan, do we have to talk about the Crusades? I hate them.
You're getting paid.
Here's the thing about the Crusades, which were a series of military expeditions from parts of Europe to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. The real reason they feature so prominently in history is because we've endlessly romanticized the story of the Crusades. We've created this simple narrative with characters to root for and to root against, and it's been endlessly idealized by the likes of Sir Walter Scott, and there are knights with swords and lion hearts. No, Stan, lion hearts. Thank you. Let's start by saying that initially the Crusades were not a holy war on the part of Europeans against Islam.
He actually does this a lot of his videos. He takes ideas that most people have accepted as true. Majority of us, we all agree that the Crusades were a series of wars based on religion, by definition a holy war. And he just says, no, that's not true, and then just doesn't back it up with evidence.
But in important ways, the Crusades were driven by religious faith.
So the Crusades were driven by religious faith, and they were between two distinctly different religions, and they were fought, making them wars, but they're not holy wars. No.
Mr. Green, religion causes all wars. Imagine no... I'm going to cut you off right there before you violate copyright me from the past, but as usual, you're wrong. Simple readings of history are rarely sufficient.
Can we just take that clip and just put it at the beginning of every single one of his videos? Because I feel like all of his videos are just simplification of history to support whatever narrative he goes into it with. And then he just doesn't justify any of his points. But remember, oversimplification is horrible.
Simple readings of history are rarely sufficient. By the way, when did my handwriting get so much better? I mean, if the Crusades had been brought on by the lightning-fast rise of the Islamic Empire and a desire to keep in Christian hands the land of Jesus, then they would have started in the 8th century.
Okay, there's two big points that are wrong with this. First of all, he said lightning fast expansion of the Islamic Empire. Exactly, it was lightning fast. Islam didn't start up until 623, and already the Muslim Empire controlled what was the height of the Ottoman Empire. It only took them 200 years. It was extremely fast, and there's no way that Europe could have properly reacted within 200 years. By the 8th century, the time he wanted the Crusades to start, if it was supposedly a religious war, which it actually was, then Europe was not prepared at all. There's only two ways that they could have really started the war. It was through Anatolia helping the Byzantines, or it was through Iberia helping the former Visigothic kingdom. But neither of those areas were ready to take on the Muslims at their full strength, and neither of those two areas would receive proper support from Europe, because the Iberian Peninsula, it was just remnants hanging out in the mountains in the northern of Iberia, and those Christians had no chance of taking on the strong Umayyad Caliphate, which had just conquered Iberia. A crusade would have been a terrible time there, and no pope would have rightfully called that. And in the east, under the Byzantines, in Anatolia, they've been getting their asses handed to them for 200 years. There's absolutely no chance that Europe, disconjointed as it was, and also Germanic as it was in the north especially, there's no way they would have been able to unite enough people to take on the Islamic Empire while it's rapidly expanding and at its height. Calling the Crusades now 200 years later was a much better idea, because now the Islamic Empire is more fractured and there's infighting. That's a much better time to call a religious crusade than it would have been in the 8th century.
But early Islamic dynasties like the Umayyads and the Abbasids were perfectly happy with Christians and Jews living among them as long as they paid a tax. And plus, the Christian pilgrimage business was awesome for the Islamic Empire's economy. But then a new group of Muslims, the Seljuk Turks, moved into the region, and they sacked the holy cities and made it much more difficult for Christians to make their pilgrimages. And while they quickly realized their mistake, it was already too late. The Byzantines, who'd had their literal asses kicked at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, felt the threat and called upon the West for help. So the first official crusade
I like how he talks about it as the first official crusade, because what he's really doing here is he's acknowledging the fact that the Byzantines have been fighting wars against the Muslims for years and years and years to retake land that was taken from them, Christian land. However, it was never officially sanctioned by the Pope, so it's not really a crusade, but nonetheless it is an example of religious war. Nonetheless, it is an example of the West reacting to the Muslim expansion and fighting back against it, just like he said it should have been before the official crusade was called, yet he's going to ignore that. He's not going to delve into it.
Simple readings of history are rarely sufficient. Began with a call to arms by Pope Urban II in 1095 CE. This was partly because Urban wanted to unite Europe, and he'd figured out the lesson the rest of us learned from alien invasion movies. The best way to get people to unite is to give them a common enemy. So Urban called on all the bickering knights and nobility of Europe, and he saith unto his people, "Let us go forth and help the Byzantines, because then maybe they will acknowledge my awesomeness and get rid of their stupid not having me as Pope thing. And while we're at it, let's liberate Jerusalem."
The claim that the Pope just wanted to essentially get enough popularity to become the major figurehead for the Orthodox religion is perfectly legitimate. It makes sense. But he's framing it as the primary or one of the primary reasons for the crusade, completely ignoring the tension between the Muslims and the Christians. He's just making it sound like the Pope wanted to lead the Eastern Orthodoxy, so he called a crusade. That line of thinking doesn't make any sense. If that was the case, why didn't any of the original popes after the Eastern Orthodoxy started to really develop in the Byzantine Empire call a crusade? Why didn't they call any crusade through Persia? Why didn't they call any crusade on pagan lands in the eastern areas of Europe? Why didn't they? If a crusade was really all about the Pope establishing his supremacy over another Christian church, they could have done this long before, but they didn't, because it was about a conflict between the Christians and the Muslims.
I'm paraphrasing, by the way. Shifting the focus to Jerusalem was really important because the Crusades were not primarily military operations.
They weren't primarily military operations. They went in with an army and marched and killed Muslims and fought for land to establish a safe route for Christian pilgrims, but it wasn't a military operation.
They were pilgrimages. Theologically, Christianity didn't have an idea of a holy war. Like, war might be just, but fighting wasn't something that got you into heaven. But
that's very true. Fighting is not in the Bible as something that will get you into heaven, but what is in the Bible about what will get you into heaven is sacrifice in service of God. Sacrifice can be both your life or material possessions. There are countless stories from Jesus where he talks about the sacrifice of followers of God in order to get into heaven. That's why there was the famous parable about rich man will never get into heaven. You need to give up your material possessions in order to get the love of your God. And there was also the idea of sacrificing your own life in order to get into heaven. And this can be seen in 30 out of the first 50 popes were executed and therefore made saints and let into heaven. So the Crusades may not have been a call to fight to get into heaven, but they were a call to give up your own time, your own life, even to get into heaven.
a pilgrimage to a holy shrine could help you out on that front, and Urban had the key insight to pitch the crusade as a pilgrimage with a touch of warring on the side. I do the same thing to my kid every night. I'm not feeding you dinner featuring animal crackers. I'm feeding you animal crackers featuring dinner. Simple readings of history are rarely sufficient.
To pitch the Crusades as an animal cracker dinner for children, I think is completely ridiculous. He makes it sound like it's an underhanded trick. When you try to get a kid to eat dinner or vegetables, you're essentially doing a bit of an underhanded trick. You're saying, oh, here's some sweets, and then you force that healthy stuff into them. But the Crusades weren't framed like that. The Pope made it very clear this is a military operation. You're going in to fight for the Holy Land. It wasn't like he said, hey, let's all take a pilgrimage with our swords, hope we don't get stabbed. That would be completely dishonest, and that's not how the Papal Bull was even written.
An open letter to animal crackers. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's animal crackers. Thanks, Stan. Hi there, animal crackers. It's me, John Green. Thanks for being delicious, but let me throw out a crazy idea here.
Why is this even in the video?
One last myth to dispel. The Crusades were not an example of early European colonization of the Middle East, even if they did create some European-ish kingdoms there for a while. That's a much later post- and anti-colonialist view that comes, at least in part, from a Marxist reading of history. In the case of the Crusades, it was argued the knights who went adventuring in the Levant were the second and third sons of wealthy nobles who, because of European inheritance rules, had little to look forward to by staying in Europe, and lots to gain in terms of plunder by going to the east. Cool theory, bro, but it's not true. First, most of the people who responded to the call to crusade weren't knights at all. They were poor people. And secondly, most of the nobles who did go crusading were lords of estates, not their wastrel kids. But more importantly, that analysis ignores religious motivations.
You just said it wasn't a holy war. the beginning of the video was all about how it wasn't a holy war, but now you're explaining how most of the people were peasants who were religiously motivated to go to war for their religion. What?
We've approached religions as historical phenomena, thinking about how, for instance, the capricious environment of Mesopotamia led to a capricious cadre of Mesopotamian gods. But just as the world shapes religion, religion also shapes the world. And some modern historians might ignore religious motivations, but medieval crusaders sure as hell didn't. I mean, when people came up with that idiom, they clearly thought hell was for sure. To the crusaders, they were taking up arms to protect Christ and his kingdom. And what better way to show your devotion to God than putting a cross on your sleeve, spending 5 to 6 times your annual income to outfit yourself and all your horses, and heading for the Holy Land. So when these people cried out, "God wills it," to explain their reasons for going,
That's another point. You literally discounted the idea of a holy war. However, they're yelling, "God wills it," to going to war in the Middle East. This is like the 4th time you've done this. You tried to establish in the beginning that it wasn't what most people assume the Crusades were, a holy war. You do this all the time in all your videos. You just say, here's a popular conception, you're wrong, and then you go on with the video with no mind towards the fact that you discounted that popular conception, and now you're providing evidence for that conception, not your own.
we should do them the favor of believing them. And the results of the First Crusade seem to indicate that God had willed it, following the lead of roving preachers with names like Peter the Rabbit, Peter the Hermit. Stan, you're always making history less cool. Fine. Following preachers like Peter the Hermit, thousands of peasants and nobles alike volunteered for the First Crusade. It got off to kind of a rough start because pilgrims kept robbing those they'd encounter along the way. Plus, there was no real leader, so there were constant rivalries between nobles about who could supply the most troops. Notable among the notables were Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Toronto, and Raymond of Toulouse. But despite the rivalries and the disorganization, the Crusaders were remarkably, some would say miraculously, successful.
I don't think I would describe walking for 4 years and then kind of getting down to Jerusalem-ish, but then realizing all of the wells are either buried or poisoned and that there's no trees is remarkable. I wouldn't describe taking off your shoes and having to march around the city because you're so desperate for God's intervention as remarkable, and I wouldn't describe the chance arrival of Genoese sailors and then having them dismantle their ship and run over to you and give you that wood to make siege towers and then barely making the siege possible as remarkable.
By the time they arrived in the Levant, they were fighting not against the Seljuk Turks, but against Fatimid Egyptians who had captured the Holy Land from the Seljuks, thereby making the Turks none too pleased with the Egyptians. At Antioch, the Crusaders reversed a seemingly hopeless situation when a peasant found the spear that had pierced Christ's side hidden under a church, thereby raising morale enough to win the day. And then they did the impossible. They took Jerusalem, securing it for Christendom and famously killing a lot of people in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, the Crusaders succeeded in part because the Turkish Muslims, who were Sunnis, did not step up to help the Egyptians, who were Shia. But that kind of complicated inter-Islamic rivalry gets in the way of the awesome narrative.
Okay, I love this. I love how he takes the events of the Crusades and then discounts them and says, well, the Crusaders really wouldn't have won if the Muslims weren't infighting. Exactly. That's exactly why the Crusades didn't happen 400 years before this, when Islam first started. It's exactly why they didn't happen 200 years when you said they should have happened in the 8th century, because the Muslims were more united then. They weren't united now, and that made it a prime time to begin a crusade. It didn't make any sense for them to have done it before, but now that they're in fighting, that's when they would have done it. That was part of the reason why it happened.
The Christians just saw it as a miracle. So by 1100 CE, European nobles held both Antioch and Jerusalem as Latin Christian kingdoms.
You made the assertion earlier that this was a pilgrimage. Fine, it's not a holy war, it's a pilgrimage. An armed pilgrimage, explicitly stated by the Pope that it would be an armed pilgrimage. But you then bring up this point that there were already Christians living there, so why did they even do the crusade in the first place? Well, the Christians living there by law were second-class citizens who had to pay exorbitant tax rates to their Muslim overlords, and they could not hold high political office. They only could hold minor positions that were essentially puppet positions, so the Muslims had more prestige. And the Christians living there, of course they weren't Latin, but it's not like they had complete economic, political, or just in general freedom. The whole idea was the Crusades was to create an area controlled by European Christians to allow the free pilgrimage of European Christians, which wasn't present before. You're trying to discount the entire idea of the Crusades by saying, well, there was already some Christians living there, and they might not have been Latin, but Why would you do the Crusades? You would do the Crusades because their goal was to establish a free area for Christian Europeans to make pilgrimage. And that was the end result of at least the First Crusade.
I say Latin to make the point that there were lots of Christians living in these cities before the Crusaders arrived. They just weren't Catholic, they were Orthodox, a point that will become relevant shortly. We're going to skip the Second Crusade because it bores me and move on to the Third Crusade.
Simple readings of history are rarely sufficient.
Because it's the famous one. Broadly speaking, the Third Crusade was a European response to the emergence of a new Islamic power, neither Turkish nor Abbasid. The Egyptian, although he was really a Kurd, Sultan al-Malik al-Nasser Salah el-Din Yusuf, better known to the West as Saladin. Saladin, having consolidated his power in Egypt, sought to expand by taking Damascus and eventually Jerusalem, which he did successfully because he was an amazing general.
I love the intro he gave Saladin. I can't wait to see what he'll give the Christian leaders.
And then the loss of Jerusalem caused Pope Gregory VIII to call for a third crusade. Three of the most important kings in Europe answered the call. Philip, cowardly schemer II of France, Richard Lionheart I of England, and Frederick I am going to drown anticlimactically on the journey while trying to bathe in a river, Barbarossa, of the not holy, not Roman, and not imperial Holy Roman Empire.
Okay, first of all, that's just a quote from someone else. That isn't even your own opinion. And second of all, how is that at all relevant? How were any of those intros relevant? Yet Saladin gets this great, amazing intro about how great of a commander he is, and I would agree he's a great military commander, but these Europeans also had military achievements, and they also were important. Yet, just remember, if we're drowning in a river, same.
Simple readings of history are rarely sufficient.